Take my bride, let's go for a ride in my newfangled automobile. This is where we will go. Nobody knows, but it's sure a great way to feel. Behind the wheel of the Speed Meter Steel, it's my newfangled automobile.
Well, hello and welcome to Vintage Car History. I'm Wild Bill, and today is a special day because there are a lot of special people who built the automotive industry who may not have necessarily built cars. For example, the Michelin brothers that we've spoken of, but one of those people was Henry Timken of Timken Bearing. And today we have a special guest here at the Canton Classic Car Museum, Mr. Bob Leibensberger. I hope I said that right.
You said that right.
I got it right that time. This is only this third or fourth take or so. This man, of course, is former president of the Timken Bearing portion of that corporation, and he's here to share with us some of the history and the importance of just what Henry Timken did for the early automotive industry. Bob, thank you for being with us here today.
Good to be here.
Okay. Now, Henry Timken, where was he from? What got him involved in the business?
Well, he came from Germany. He was 7 years old when his father brought the family. His mother had died 2 years earlier, and he brought the family to St. Louis, primarily because St. Louis was the jumping off port for going west.
Right.
And a lot of Germans were coming in through St. Louis, and the Timken family decided they could be in the carriage business and wagon business and make wagons for people when they arrived there to buy and move west. Mm. And that's how the company got started way back in the 1850s. So that's how Henry got into the car business, or the carriage business. And that's where he started his business.
Oh yes, in fact, I know that there's other companies, for example, Volvo in Europe also got started in the same way. But of course, Henry, he was, into the carriages at the time, but he didn't continue with that throughout the entire period, did he?
Well, he invented what was called the Timken cross spring suspension. It was like independent suspension in carriages, like you would have later in the automobile industry. Mm-hmm. And he made enough money that he could retire and live on his royalties. And he retired when he was like 57 years old.
Must be nice.
And moved to California and got in the real estate investment business. Mm. But he and his wife Frederica, who he had married, her family was also in the wagon carriage building business. Mm. And so they moved to San Diego, but they traveled a lot. And what they did was travel in the U.S., but they also went back to Germany. And when he went back to Germany, he started to realize that the automotive industry was further advanced there than in the U.S. because of Daimler and Mercedes and Benz. And anyway, he also ran into a man by the name of Frederick Fisher, who had come up with a ball bearing. He had invented the bicycle, a German bicycle that he had patented, and so he ran into him, and he realized the potential future for the anti-friction bearing industry connected to an automotive business, and so he started looking around.
What year was this that he was doing?
This would be in the 1890s. Yeah, when he came back. But anyway, when he decided to get back into the bearing business, so he came back to St. Louis, and his sons, H.H. Timken and W.R. Timken, Bob Timken, and H.H. was Henry connection. They were in the carriage business, so in wagon business there. So he came back and went into business with them. But he started to focus the business on making an anti-friction bearing. One of the first things he did when he came back, he took H.H. Timken, he went to Europe for about 6 months and looked at the auto industry, and they looked at the bearing industry that was developing there. and came back and decided they wanted to invent a different kind of bearing, a tapered bearing. And so they started to work on that, and obviously became successful, and then decided to launch a bearing business that they started in like 1898.
Okay, so in 1898, you know, he had come up and he basically reinvented the wheel or the ball and made a new type of bearing.
Right.
And in fact, we got a sample of it over there.
Yeah.
We can take a look at it in a second.
And the rolling element, instead of being a ball, was a taper,
Mm-hmm.
tapered bearing, and it had the ability to carry more load and perform better than a ball bearing, which has point contact. And it also has the advantage of taking radial and thrust loads, which when you put a bearing on the front wheel of a car and you go around a car at about 30 miles an hour, you're putting a heck of a lot of stress on the bearing. So that's how he got into the bearing business.
All right, Bob, so what are we looking at with this bearing?
Well, you're looking at the actual rear, the bearing you see here is the actual rear bearing that was in this car that we cut away and replaced with a normal Timken bearing. But the story behind this is, for those of you who restore cars and know what a front wheel looks like in most cars, you buy 2 single-row tapered roller bearings, you mount that in a hub that the customer would make, and then you put seals on it, and then you put that on the spindle of the front wheel of a car. And that's from the beginning of the auto industry, except for the St. Louis. That's the way most tapered roller bearings were used in the front wheel of a car. What in the 1970s, the auto industry wanted to pass on more of the building of the front axle of the car to the bearing industry. They wanted it to be sealed, they wanted it to be pre-adjusted. So we came up with what was called the Unipack in 1970, and we thought we invented the Unipack bearing. When we took the bearing out of the St. Louis, we realized that the first bearing that Henry Timken ever made was a Unipack bearing that we thought we invented in the 1970s.
I guess you were ahead of your time.
Yeah, it was pre-adjusted, it had seals on, and so it showed how clever a person he was. So that's the story of the bearing. Now, with time, we ended up making the hub, and we called that a package bearing sensor pack, because we ended up mounting when ABS systems came along, automatic braking system. They had to know the rotation of the wheels, so we built a sensor into the front bearing, and that's what the bearing looks like today.
Bicycles, inspired him to get the frictionless, and then inventing a new type of bearing that, would work under the loads of an automobile, handle the weight and the inertia that's involved. Because, as you know, when you turn a car, the car doesn't necessarily want to turn, and so that's going to put additional weight on your outside. And so, how did the automotive industry respond to this bearing?
Well, it was a technical success, but the automotive business didn't move as fast in America as it did in Europe. And so when he put his sons in business, they actually lost money for about the first 2-3 years. And had to come back to Henry for some money and help. And Henry continued to support them. And ultimately, the business took off, and by about 1906 and 7, they were starting to do quite well. And the industry was accepting it. They had in the front wheel bearing business by about 1909, 1910. They had like 60% of the business.
Okay,
And
so
so the customers responded pretty well.
well, I know the car that we're sitting in right now is a 1904 St. Louis. And this particular car, at least the make of St. Louis, was the first to actually order these new bearings from Timken.
Absolutely, and that's why we restored the St. Louis for the centennial, which was celebrated in 1999. And the way it came about was I got a call one day from my friend Bill Maddox, and he had a request if we actually made a replacement bearing for this car from the Doris family in St. Louis. And of course we didn't, but that being in the car collecting business myself, I started in the car collecting business when I was like 10 years old. My father decided to buy antique cars after World War I or World War II. And of course I was just a young kid, but I stuck my nose in all this restoration stuff. And so when I found out there was a car company that we bought from in way back, I decided it would be appropriate to have the car available, St. Louis car available when we celebrated the centennial. So I made a call on the customer, which was Doris Manufacturing, and George Doris, of course, was a big partner in the development of the St. Louis.
Right. He was the engineering side of the company.
Right. And so when I visited his son, he said, you know, I actually was going to ask him to maybe lease the car that he had to me, but he said, you know, there's one that I found in a barn in Arkansas, and my wife doesn't think I need another St. Louis car, so maybe you'd like to look at buying that. And I said, well, let's work it out, and that's what we did.
Awesome. And obviously the work was done very well, but of course the St. Louis wasn't the only car that, and of course I believe you still have the original paperwork from the first order from St. Louis.
We still, the family's in the archives, we still have the first order.
Okay, what year was that?
It was like 1899.
1899, which was the very, now keep in mind that the St. Louis car first went into manufacture in 1899. So your bearings were OEM spec, original equipment manufacturer on this car since its inception.
They were 3 axles and bearings. Timken initially was in the axle business and the bearing business, and they remained in the business until about 1910 when they separated the businesses. And H.H. Timken remained here with the bearing business, and W.R., his older brother, went with the business to Detroit and formed the Timken Detroit Axle, which ultimately was bought out by Rockwell Sander. Rockwell Corporation. So he started, as a result of what they had done, they started the cross spring business, which contributed to the auto business. Later on, they started the bearing business, and they started an axle business. So,
you know, and Bob, what I find fascinating myself is that when we're talking, 1900 and 1905, right in that era, who was the best, the greatest automotive city in the United States? That was up for grabs still. I mean, Cleveland, you had Winton, who was the largest producer of cars in 1900 in the United States. They were located in Cleveland. You had Detroit, which still had, the Detroit Motor Company was still going at that point in time. Oldsmobile and Locomobile located there. You also had, of course, Indianapolis, these were the 3 main cities. Why did Timken decide to move to Canton and be so close to Cleveland?
well, when Timken got into the business, they were what I call an assembler. They would buy all the components on the outside, and most of the suppliers were from like Pennsylvania and Ohio. So they figured they ought to get closer to their suppliers. Their biggest customer was Winton. They ought to get closer to their customer. And then Canton had an unusual situation where they, as a result of we know as Cornelius Altman here in Canton, Altman Hospital, he made a lot of money making farm equipment. And he ended up, later in life, he was like an investment banker. And he brought us a company to Canton that made alloy steel very early. And that was the 3rd reason that they came. So they had a source of supply because they wanted to start making their own parts.
Right.
So they wanted to be close to their supplier of steel, and they wanted a good source, and that they found in this company in Canton. So.
And Timken, by the time we get to 1910, you were already supplying well over 50% of all of the bearing hub assemblies that were being sold to any car manufacturer in the United States, as well as quite a significant amount in Europe as well.
Right. Yeah, the big customer was, of course, Ford, but we didn't start selling to Ford until after World War I. So, and that's when we started to sell to Ford. That's when we took over the majority of it.
Yes, and so Timken bearings. If you have a American car, a true vintage or veteran car, most likely it has those bearings in it.
Right.
Right. You know, Bob, it sounds to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, that there really is a connection historically between Timken and Michelin, in as much as both companies were run by people that were creating product for the early automotive industry, and they created a product that, quite frankly, dominated that portion of their industries. Do you think that's reasonable to say?
Yeah, I don't know. You said there was a connection between...
That they both, you know, whereas they made tires and you made hubs, but you both companies.
Right.
You know, you didn't, I mean, Michelin never made a car.
Right.
Timken never made a car, but the components that you made wound up in cars all over the world.
Well, that was, as we got into the automotive business and the country and making transportation vehicles, and also, you know, when the airplane industry started, they wanted to buy a lot of the components rather than make them. Like General Motors got into the bearing business. They bought a Hyatt, which was an early producer of a straight roller bearing. But you know, most companies didn't want to make their own bearings. They wanted to be able to buy them. Even some companies bought engines and transmissions. Like, you know, Rockwell made differentials for the car industry and transmissions. So they call those core technologies. Something that everybody used.
It's still a method of industry to this day.
Right.
And I understand Mr. Henry Timken was quite a racing enthusiast.
Well, the story, well, he was developing the tapered roller bearing in the 1890s. He was also president of the Carriage Builders Association. And in 1895, the Chicago Time-Herald wanted to have a race. Europe had, for example, the Paris to Bordeaux race to demonstrate the benefits of the automotive in coming out to people. So anyway, Time Herald wanted to have a similar race from Chicago to Milwaukee, and he was one of two judges for the race. Well, the race that they ran in the United States was not as successful as the one in Paris and in Europe. Primarily, they ran the race on Thanksgiving Day, and the weather turned out to be bad. And so they didn't get to Milwaukee. They turned around before they got even halfway. And the cars, they entered like 12 cars or something like that, but only 2 finished. And they didn't look very stellar. So the reputation that the auto industry got in the United States was not as successful as it was in Europe.
Yeah. Well, if I recall, that particular race there were only 2 cars even finished it.
Right.
One was, I believe, a Benz Victoria, and the other one was a Duria.
Which was from the United States.
That was the U.S. one.
Yeah. And it won the race. But there's actually a picture of Henry Timken in a Benz car at the race. It's on the cover of the book we published for the history of the Timken Company, Missouri to Mars, that was published for the centennial. That has the thing about that book is not only the history of the Timken Company, it's the history of the auto industry, because of the connections that Timken had with so many of the customers and how they interacted with the customers. So
I understand, Bob, you're writing a book as well.
I'm writing my autobiography right now. So
Okay, so have you chosen a title for your autobiography?
I have Proud Heritage.
Proud Heritage.
Proud Heritage, Family, Faith, Freedom, and Friends.
Proud Heritage, Family, Faith, Freedom, and Friends.
Right.
I like that. Bob, this I've been absolutely thrilled to have you with me today and to talk about this car and the history. Looking forward to your book. And so we'll have to look for that on Amazon.com when the chance gets.
I got to give credit to the employees. When I ended up bringing this car back, of course, the word got around that I bought an old car, and I was trying to figure out how to get it restored, and I got a lot of help from the employees because I had a visit one day from Gary Hussar and his father, suggesting that they might be volunteers that might be willing to restore the car. So I said, well, that sounds like a good idea. The only thing I worried about was maybe we'd have 100 people that wanted to volunteer. Well, we put it in the newsletter that we were going to be doing this, and we ended up getting 15 associates who restored the car. And they did a fantastic job on it, and it was a fun experience.
Oh, in fact, I think we're going to have a fun experience with this car in a little bit, aren't we? Bob, I have to thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. We're going to talk more about Timken and about the St. Louis and definitely about this car.
Good.
So stay tuned.
Good.
Now that's a beauty. That's our 1904 St. Louis. With we've got Gary at the wheel and Bob is his mechanic.
Right.
Well, that's the position if you're racing, isn't it? What an absolutely beautiful car. Let's learn a whole lot more about it, shall we?
Yes.
Okay, we're going to take a closer look at the 1904 St. Louis here. We have Gary is going to be kind enough to let us know what it is that we are looking at. Okay, so we have some a number of different buttons here on the floor. What are these different pedals?
All right, we have one of the pedals is a throttle.
It's the throttle there, okay.
Okay. The other one is spark advance. The newer vehicles have, in the 60s, would have a vacuum advance. Newer cars are electronic. Early cars were manual,
Right.
and that's what you would
I'm used to seeing on these earlier cars the advance on the steering column, not on the
on this,
the
it's
floor.
on the floor.
What about this small pedal right behind you?
This is an exhaust cutout.
Okay.
Bypasses the muffler
All right.
and increases horsepower.
Alrighty. And how about this
That's
little guy
just a
down
bell.
here? It's a bell. So if you press that, it means you're a ding-a-ling?
Yeah. Sometimes it.
Of course, we see St. Louis Motor Car Company. Now, we're looking inside here. We have now let's walk through this engine here.
Okay. First of all, we're talking. It is a one-cylinder, 5¼ bore, with a 6-inch stroke, which equates to about 130 cubic inch, and with a whopping 7 horsepower. And the way I explain that to people, most people have a push lawnmower that has 7 horsepower. Okay, it has a big flywheel, 133 pound it is, that keeps the motor moving once it's going.
Gotcha. Yeah, that is
It
that is full size.
The motor and transmission are one integral casting. The transmission is included with the motor.
I see. Chain drive.
Chain drive, 2-speed, we got low, high, and reverse.
Gotcha. And how about the brakes?
Brake is operated by the handle. Brake goes forward to stop,
Okay.
and it is mounted on the back of the motor on the
So
side.
this is your brake handle here.
Yep, go forward for brake, back is a clutch, and you pull it, and that puts it in gear.
Okay. And
You have the 3 speeds here, that's low. In the middle would be second, all the way forward would be reversed.
beautiful. And back here we have, that's your chain, and this large hub here.
That's just a differential in there, and that's where the parking brake's located.
Okay.
This is the exhaust cutout that I was talking about.
Okay, let's get a good
When
look
you
at that there.
push that,
Boom, boom.
it opens and bypasses the muffler.
Oh yeah, that definitely meets modern emission standards.
Yes. One of the interesting things about this car is radiator is up front.
Right.
The tank for the radiator is under the seat, right here. So not only do you have a front seat, but you got a hot seat.
Well, in winters in Ohio, that's not
Yes.
a bad thing.
And not a bad thing. One of the unique features of this car is it has a rack and pinion steering.
As we can see right here. That's definitely rack and pinion.
Yes. The rack's coming out of here. You can see it. See it.
Yep, right there. Oh, let's get a good view of that. She's turning.
He had patents on the float on the carburetor, didn't he?
Yeah. And then another issue with these, not issue, the valves. You have a camshaft that operates the exhaust valve. The intake valve's operated by vacuum from the motor. And there's a ramp, the gas pedal, that allows it, and the vacuum opens the valve up farther, which allows more fuel in. So it is not cam operated like the exhaust valve would be.
Okay, so how do we fire this thing up, Gary?
Okay, first of all, this is a oil dripper that drips since the cylinder sits horizontal. It does not get oil. It has a oil drop that drops oil on top of the cylinder. This is the ignition, shuts it off and on. It's got a dual ignition, 2 batteries. You can, if one battery goes low, you can switch it and run the other battery. It is a hand crank, comes right off of the crankshaft. This is a compression release, which makes the car much easier to crank. So it'll start with the compression release open, and it makes it much easier. You take and flood the carburetor a little bit. It's the same with operating a choke, but what I'm doing is pushing a little valve that opens the fuel, floods it like. And then if everything goes right, then you close the then you can.
Well, now she's got lots of power, huh?
That's got lots of power.
And this is what that big flywheel moving. Let's see her run. See her drive. see. Mind if I take the front seat?
No problem. There's a foot thing to step on the other side, is it?
All right. Sitting it.
Get a picture of our mechanic waiting. Yeah.
Just waiting to fix it. Waiting for it to catch fire. You would not want to do this in a blizzard, right? Step plate here so you can get off the thing. Now how's that for a wild ride?
That's it.
This is how it's done, 1900 style. Bob, Gary, thank you so much for this time we spent together and for this absolutely beautiful car. See what she can do. Thanks for watching Vintage Car History, and we'll see you next week. Peace.